The accident. The sun was shining brightly as children laughed and played in the schoolyard. Emma, a cheerful and lively 10-year-old, ran across the field with her friends. They were playing tag, and Emma, being the fastest, darted between her classmates, giggling as she tried to escape. Suddenly, she tripped over a loose rock on the ground. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her left leg twisting awkwardly beneath her. She hit the ground hard, a sharp pain shooting through her leg. Emma screamed, tears filling her eyes as her friends stopped in their tracks. "Emma!" shouted her best friend, Lily, as she rushed to her side. Emma's leg looked swollen, and she couldn't move it. Lily tried to help her sit up, but Emma winced in pain. "It hurts so much," she cried, clutching her leg. Their teacher, Mr. Harris, ran over after hearing the commotion. He looked worried as he kneeled beside Emma. "Don't worry, Emma. We'll get you to the hospital right away," he assured her, his voice calm but urgent. Lily and Mr. Harris helped Emma onto a makeshift stretcher made from a gym mat. A few students helped carry her to the school van. Emma's cries of pain echoed in everyone's ears as they drove to the nearest hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, the scene was chaotic. Patients filled the waiting room, nurses hurried back and forth, and the sound of beeping monitors and crying babies filled the air. Mr. Harris approached the reception desk, where a nurse sat typing on her computer. "Excuse me," he said, trying to get her attention. "This girl has a broken leg. She needs help immediately." The nurse barely glanced up. She looked annoyed as she waved him off. "Fill out the forms and wait for your turn," she said coldly, pointing to a clipboard on the counter. "But she's in a lot of pain," Lily exclaimed, her voice trembling. "She can't wait." The nurse sighed and looked at Emma, who was now pale and clutching her leg tightly. "We're very busy," the nurse said flatly. "There are more serious cases ahead of her. She'll have to wait." Mr. Harris felt his anger rising, but tried to stay calm. "Please," he said, "this is urgent. She's just a child." The nurse raised an eyebrow. "And so are half the patients here. You'll be called when it's her turn." Emma's cries grew louder as her leg throbbed in pain. Lily held her hand tightly, whispering, "It's going to be okay." But even she was starting to lose hope. Nearby, a janitor mopping the floor noticed the commotion. He was an older man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. He walked over and gently asked, "What's going on?" "This nurse won't help Emma," Lily said angrily. "Her leg is broken, and she's in so much pain." The janitor frowned and looked at the nurse. "Why not help the child?" he asked softly. "Mind your own business," the nurse snapped. "You're here to clean, not to tell me how to do my job." The janitor didn't argue. Instead, he quietly pushed his mop aside and went to find a wheelchair. A few minutes later, he returned, carefully helping Mr. Harris lift Emma into the chair. "Thank you," Mr. Harris said gratefully. The janitor nodded and whispered, "Someone should know about this." He then walked away, pulling out his phone and making a call. Meanwhile, Emma's father, Mr. Lawson, was in a high-rise office downtown, completely unaware of what was happening to his daughter. He was in an important business meeting, but his phone vibrated with an urgent call. "Excuse me," he said to his colleagues as he stepped out to answer. "Sir," said the voice on the other end, "there's an issue at the hospital involving your daughter." Mr. Lawson froze. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. The caller explained the situation briefly. Mr. Lawson's expression darkened as he ended the call. Without a second thought, he grabbed his car keys and headed straight for the hospital. Back in the waiting room, Emma's condition seemed to be getting worse. Lily kept wiping the sweat from her friend's forehead, trying to comfort her. "I can't take this anymore," Mr. Harris said, standing up to confront the nurse again. "This is unacceptable. She's just a child in pain." The nurse rolled her eyes and said, "Sir, if you can't wait, feel free to take her somewhere else." Unbeknownst to her, Mr. Lawson was on his way. and everything was about to change. Desperate pleas. Emma's cries echoed through the hospital waiting room as she clutched her swollen leg. Her face was pale, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead. Lily sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. "Just hang on, Emma," Lily whispered, though her voice was trembling. "Someone will help us soon." But help seemed far away. The nurse at the reception desk continued typing on her computer, completely ignoring Emma's pain. The waiting room was filled with murmurs and uneasy glances from other patients and their families. Some whispered to each other, shocked at the nurse's lack of care. Mr. Harris walked back to the nurse's desk, his frustration mounting. "I've been patient," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "This girl is in serious pain. She needs treatment now." The nurse sighed dramatically and looked up at him with a bored expression. "Sir, I told you before, there are more urgent cases ahead of her. Everyone here thinks their situation is an emergency." "But she's just a child," Mr. Harris argued. "Her leg might be broken. Isn't that serious enough for you?" The nurse shrugged. "She's not bleeding out, is she? If you can't wait, maybe you should take her somewhere else." Mr. Harris clenched his fists but stopped himself from saying something he might regret. He turned back to Emma and Lily, shaking his head in frustration. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. Emma's breathing grew heavier as she whispered, "It hurts so much, Lily. I can't take it." Tears streamed down her face. Lily's heart broke seeing her friend in such pain. She stood up and marched to the nurse. "Please," she pleaded. "She's my best friend. Can't you see she's suffering?" The nurse finally looked at Lily, her face softening for a brief moment. But then she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Look, kid," she said, "I know this is hard for you, but this is how things work here. Everyone has to wait their turn." Lily opened her mouth to argue but was interrupted by a kind voice behind her. "Maybe I can help," said the janitor who had been mopping the floor earlier. The janitor crouched beside Emma's wheelchair, his gentle eyes meeting hers. "Don't worry, little one," he said softly. "I'll see what I can do." Lily looked at him with hope. "Can you talk to someone? Please." The janitor nodded and stood up. He walked over to the nurse and spoke quietly, though his voice carried a tone of quiet authority. "This child needs urgent care," he said. "You might want to reconsider your priorities." The nurse glared at him. "Who do you think you are? You're just the janitor." She snapped. "Stay out of this." The janitor didn't argue. Instead, he stepped away and pulled out his phone. As he dialed, his expression changed, becoming more serious. He spoke in a low voice, though no one could hear what he was saying. Meanwhile, back in the waiting area, Mr. Harris paced nervously. Emma's pain was clearly getting worse, and every minute felt like an eternity. Lily knelt beside her friend and wiped her tears with a tissue. "You're so strong, Emma," she whispered. "Your dad will come soon, I promise." But even Lily was beginning to doubt her own words. Where was Emma's father? Just then, the janitor returned. He knelt down to adjust the wheelchair, making Emma a bit more comfortable. "Help is on the way," he said quietly. Lily looked up at him. "Who did you call?" The janitor smiled faintly, but didn't answer. He stood up and disappeared into the hallway, leaving Lily with more questions than answers. At that moment, far away in the city, Mr. Lawson was racing through traffic. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he thought about his daughter. "Emma needs me," he muttered to himself, his heart pounding. He didn't know the full details of what was happening, but the call he received was enough to make him drop everything. Back at the hospital, the nurse remained oblivious to the storm brewing. She continued her work, dismissing the whispers and glares from the other patients. But change was coming, and it was coming fast. Arrival of power. Emma's father, Mr. Lawson, drove through the city at breakneck speed. His mind raced with worry and anger. The call he had received about his daughter's condition and the hospital's neglect replayed in his mind. "No one ignores my child," he muttered, his jaw tightening. As he approached the hospital, his black luxury car gleamed in the sunlight, turning heads as it pulled into the parking lot. The driver's door swung open, and Mr. Lawson stepped out, his presence commanding attention. He was a tall man with sharp features, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. His expression was a mix of calm authority and quiet fury. Inside the hospital, the waiting room remained tense. Emma's cries had grown softer, but her pale face and labored breathing told everyone she was struggling. Lily held Emma's hand, glancing anxiously at the entrance. "Your dad will come soon, Emma," she whispered. "I know he will." Mr. Harris stood nearby, glowering at the nurse who continued to ignore their pleas. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. The nurse, still at her desk, noticed the commotion outside as Mr. Lawson entered the hospital. She glanced up briefly, unimpressed, and returned to her work. Mr. Lawson strode through the waiting room, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Emma. His heart sank as he saw his daughter slumped in the wheelchair, her face pale with pain. "Emma," he called out, his voice steady but filled with concern. Emma's eyes fluttered open, and a weak smile spread across her lips. "Dad," she whispered. Lily jumped up. "Mr. Lawson, she's been waiting so long. The nurse won't help her." Mr. Lawson knelt beside Emma, gently brushing her hair away from her face. "I'm here now," he said softly. "You're going to be okay." He turned to Lily and Mr. Harris. "Thank you for staying with her. I'll take care of this now." Standing up, Mr. Lawson's demeanor changed. His warm concern for Emma was replaced with a cold, steely resolve. He walked to the nurse's desk, his footsteps echoing loudly in the tense silence. The nurse didn't look up as he approached. "Excuse me," Mr. Lawson said, his voice calm but firm. The nurse sighed, annoyed. "Yes?" she asked without making eye contact. "My daughter has been waiting here with a broken leg," Mr. Lawson said, his tone measured but icy. "And you have refused to help her." The nurse finally looked up, her irritation clear. "Sir, as I've told others, we are very busy. She'll be seen when it's her turn." Mr. Lawson leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Do you know who I am?" The nurse rolled her eyes. "Does it matter? Everyone here thinks they're important. We follow procedures." A few patients in the waiting room gasped softly, recognizing Mr. Lawson. Whispers spread quickly. "Isn't that the hospital owner?" One murmured. "I've seen him in the news," another added. Mr. Lawson's lips curved into a faint, cold smile. "It matters," he said quietly, "because I own this hospital." The nurse froze, her face draining of color. "What?" she stammered. "You heard me," Mr. Lawson said. "I own this hospital, and I have the authority to fire anyone who fails to do their job. Would you like me to start with you?" The nurse's confidence shattered as she scrambled to respond. I didn't know," she stuttered. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." "Save your apologies," Mr. Lawson interrupted sharply. "What I want is action. My daughter needs immediate care, and you have wasted precious time." The nurse leaped to her feet, calling for a doctor. "We need assistance here, right now," she shouted, her voice panicked. Within moments, a team of medical staff rushed into the waiting room, wheeling Emma into the treatment area. Mr. Lawson followed closely, his protective presence leaving no room for argument. In the hallway, the janitor watched the scene unfold with a quiet smile. He had seen Mr. Lawson's arrival, and knew things would change quickly. He picked up his mop and returned to work, his role in the unfolding drama complete. As Emma was taken into the treatment room, Mr. Lawson stayed by her side, holding her hand. "You're safe now," he told her gently. "Thank you, Dad," Emma whispered, her voice filled with relief. But Mr. Lawson wasn't done. His anger toward the nurse still simmered, and he intended to ensure no child would ever face such neglect again. Consequences begin. As Emma was being treated in the emergency room, Mr. Lawson stood outside, his arms crossed and his sharp gaze fixed on the hospital's operations. The anger he felt toward the nurse still simmered in his chest, but his primary focus was ensuring Emma's well-being. Meanwhile, the nurse who had dismissed Emma sat stiffly at her desk, her face pale. The whispers from other staff and patients about Mr. Lawson's identity reached her ears, making her heart race. Inside the waiting room, Lily and Mr. Harris sat quietly, both still shaken by the events. "Emma's lucky to have a dad like that," Lily said softly. Mr. Harris nodded. "But no one should have to fight this hard for care, no matter who they are." The janitor passed by, his mop in hand, and gave Lily an encouraging nod. Though he remained silent, his actions earlier had left an impression. In the administrative office, the head nurse received an urgent call from one of her staff. "Mr. Lawson is here," the voice on the other end said nervously. "And he's not happy." The head nurse frowned, immediately understanding the gravity of the situation. She rushed toward the waiting area, her heart pounding. Mr. Lawson was on the phone with his assistant, issuing instructions. "I want a full report on the staff here," he said coldly. "I want to know why my daughter was neglected and what procedures allowed this to happen." As he ended the call, the head nurse approached him cautiously. "Mr. Lawson," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm so sorry for what happened to your daughter. This should never have happened." "You're right," Mr. Lawson replied, his tone sharp. "It shouldn't have happened, yet it did. What are you going to do about it?" The head nurse glanced toward the reception desk where the guilty nurse was trying to appear busy. "I'll address this immediately," she said. "I assure you, actions will be taken." Mr. Lawson raised an eyebrow. "Actions are necessary," he said, "but this is bigger than just one nurse. The entire system needs to change. Start by suspending her immediately." The head nurse nodded. "Understood. I'll handle it right away." She turned and walked briskly toward the desk. The nurse saw her coming and felt her stomach drop. "Janet," the head nurse said firmly, "we need to talk. Now." The nurse stood slowly, her face pale. "I didn't mean to." "Save it," the head nurse interrupted. "Your behavior today was unacceptable, and I have no choice but to suspend you pending further review." The other staff in the waiting room exchanged glances, knowing this was a rare and serious consequence. As Janet gathered her things and left the desk, Mr. Lawson didn't even spare her a glance. His focus remained on Emma and ensuring this incident would lead to meaningful changes. Inside the emergency room, Emma was finally receiving the care she needed. The doctors reassured her that her leg would heal with proper treatment, and her pain was being managed. When Mr. Lawson entered to check on her, Emma gave him a small smile. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. He knelt beside her bed, brushing her hair gently. "No one will ever treat you like that again," he promised. Back in the administrative office, Mr. Lawson sat with the head nurse and the hospital's director. "This hospital is supposed to provide the best care," he said. "If my daughter faced this treatment, imagine how many others have been ignored." The director nodded, visibly shaken. "We will launch a full investigation, Mr. Lawson," he assured, "and we'll implement changes to ensure this never happens again." "Good," Mr. Lawson said firmly, "because if you don't, I'll find someone who will." A deeper problem. As Emma rested in her hospital room, Mr. Lawson remained vigilant. Though the immediate crisis had been resolved, he couldn't shake the thought that this incident might be part of a larger issue. If his daughter had been ignored despite her obvious injury, how many others had faced similar neglect without the power to speak up? He pulled out his phone and began making calls. His assistant, Melissa, answered promptly. "Melissa," Mr. Lawson said, his tone serious, "I want a full audit of patient complaints and staff behavior at this hospital. I want to know if this is an isolated incident or part of a pattern." "I'll get on it immediately, sir," Melissa replied. Meanwhile, word of Mr. Lawson's confrontation with the nurse spread throughout the hospital like wildfire. Staff members whispered nervously in the halls, and the head nurse worked tirelessly to ensure other patients were attended to promptly. In the break room, a junior nurse whispered to her colleague, "Did you hear about Janet? She got suspended on the spot." Her colleague nodded. "But honestly, she's been rude to patients for months. Maybe this will finally make things better." Back in Emma's room, Lily and Mr. Harris visited to check on her. "You're looking better already," Lily said, smiling. Emma grinned weakly. "The doctors say I'll be okay. My dad made sure of it." Mr. Harris looked at Mr. Lawson. "You didn't just stand up for Emma today," he said. "You stood up for everyone who's ever been ignored here." Mr. Lawson nodded, his expression firm. "No one should have to fight for basic care. I'm going to make sure no one else suffers like this." As evening approached, Melissa called back with preliminary findings. "Sir," she began, "I've gone through some of the complaint records. There's a troubling trend. Many patients, especially those without connections or insurance, report long wait times and neglect." Mr. Lawson's eyes narrowed. "Send me the full report. I want every detail." "Will do," Melissa replied. "But there's one more thing. There are rumors of certain staff members prioritizing private patients over emergencies." Mr. Lawson's jaw tightened. "That ends now," he said firmly. The next morning, Mr. Lawson called for an emergency meeting with the hospital's leadership. The board members and key staff gathered in the conference room, uneasy under his sharp gaze. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what happened to my daughter was unacceptable. But after reviewing the complaints, it's clear this hospital has systemic issues." The board members exchanged nervous glances. One of them, an older man named Dr. Reynolds, cleared his throat. "Mr. Lawson, we've had challenges with understaffing and resource allocation. These things take time to fix." "Challenges or excuses?" Mr. Lawson countered, his voice cold. "You've had time. Now it's time for accountability." As Mr. Lawson outlined his plan for reform, the janitor quietly entered the conference room, pretending to clean. He listened carefully, knowing this meeting could change the hospital's future. "I'll personally oversee these changes," Mr. Lawson continued, "and anyone unwilling to meet these standards can resign today." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Later, as Mr. Lawson walked through the hospital halls, he noticed a young mother comforting her crying child. He approached her, his voice kind. "Is everything okay?" The woman looked up, startled. "We've been waiting for hours," she said hesitantly, "but they said my son's fever isn't serious enough to see a doctor yet." Mr. Lawson's expression hardened. "Stay here," he said. "I'll handle it." He flagged down a passing doctor. "This child needs immediate attention," he said firmly. "Make it happen." The doctor nodded, rushing to assist. Resistance arises. Despite Mr. Lawson's firm stance, not everyone welcomed his reforms. As the hospital staff adjusted to the sudden changes, murmurs of discontent began to surface. Some believed Mr. Lawson was overstepping, while others feared the increased scrutiny would expose hidden practices. Janet, the nurse who had dismissed Emma, sat at home watching the news. The hospital's situation was now public knowledge, with Mr. Lawson's actions highlighted as a push for change. Janet's anger simmered as she turned off the TV. Inside the hospital, the leadership team gathered to discuss the growing pressure. Dr. Reynolds, an influential board member, voiced his concerns. "Mr. Lawson's demands are disrupting operations," he said, frowning. "We can't overhaul everything overnight." The head nurse disagreed. "But he's right," she said. "Patients are suffering, and we've ignored the signs for too long. Change is overdue." Dr. Reynolds glared at her. "Change is fine," he snapped, "but his interference risks our reputation and funding." Meanwhile, Mr. Lawson received updates from Melissa about the audit. "Sir," she said, her tone cautious, "I've uncovered evidence of staff cutting corners to meet quotas. It seems some administrators have been pushing profit over care." Mr. Lawson leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Who's responsible?" Melissa hesitated. "Dr. Reynolds is deeply involved." He's been prioritizing high-paying patients and even turning away emergencies to save resources. Mr. Lawson's eyes darkened. "Schedule a meeting with the board immediately," he ordered. The janitor, who had witnessed the hospital's flaws firsthand, noticed tension among the staff. He overheard two nurses whispering near the break room. "I heard Dr. Reynolds is planning to push back against Mr. Lawson," one said. The other nodded. "He's calling in favors from influential donors. If this gets messy, we're all caught in the middle." The janitor quietly noted their words, determined to support Mr. Lawson's efforts however he could. In the conference room, Mr. Lawson faced the board. "The audit has revealed unacceptable practices," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "Lives have been risked for profit, and I won't stand for it." Dr. Reynolds raised a hand. "Mr. Lawson, while I respect your passion, running a hospital is more complex than you realize. These decisions aren't made lightly." "But they've been made wrongly," Mr. Lawson retorted. "Effective immediately. I'm restructuring leadership. If you can't prioritize patients over profit, you're free to resign." The tension in the room was palpable. Outside the meeting, the staff and patients began noticing small but significant changes. A previously overlooked elderly man in the waiting room was now being attended to, and a young woman with a complicated pregnancy was rushed into care without delay. Lily, still by Emma's side, smiled as she saw these changes unfold. "Your dad's making a real difference," she told Emma. Emma nodded, though she remained concerned. "I just hope the people who don't want change don't try to stop him," she said softly. Back in the meeting, Dr. Reynolds refused to back down. "You may have power, Mr. Lawson, but you can't run this hospital alone," he sneered. "I don't need to run it alone," Mr. Lawson replied, his tone ice cold. "I need people who care about the patients, if you're not one of them. Consider this your last day here." As Dr. Reynolds stormed out, the remaining board members exchanged uneasy glances. A new dawn or a final battle. The tension at the hospital reached its peak. With Dr. Reynolds gone, many believed the worst was over, but Mr. Lawson knew better. True reform often stirred hidden enemies, and his fight was far from finished. In the quiet corridors, whispers grew louder. A faction of staff loyal to Dr. Reynolds began spreading rumors. They claimed Mr. Lawson's changes were causing chaos, even jeopardizing patient care. One nurse, emboldened by the unrest, openly challenged the head nurse. "This isn't how we've done things before," she snapped. "Why fix what wasn't broken?" The head nurse stood firm. "It was broken," she said. "You just didn't see it because you weren't the one suffering." Meanwhile, Mr. Lawson focused on building alliances. He held a meeting with the staff who had embraced the changes. Doctors, nurses, and even the janitor attended. "I'm not here to disrupt for the sake of disruption," Mr. Lawson said. "I'm here to create a hospital that serves everyone equally. But I can't do it alone." The janitor raised his hand. "I've seen things most people overlook," he said. "There's still resistance, but I'll do what I can to help." His words inspired others, and one by one, the staff pledged their support. Back in Emma's room, she watched as Lily played a board game with her dad. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she felt more hopeful than she had in days. "You're really changing this place, Dad," she said. Mr. Lawson smiled at her. "I promised you I would, and a Lawson never breaks a promise." But just as things seemed to stabilize, an unexpected crisis struck. Melissa burst into Mr. Lawson's office with alarming news. "Sir, there's been a data breach," she said. "Patient records were leaked, and the media is already running the story." Mr. Lawson's heart sank. "Who's behind this?" "We're still investigating," Melissa replied. "But it's clearly an attempt to discredit your reforms." Determined not to back down, Mr. Lawson held a press conference. Standing before a sea of cameras, he addressed the public. "This hospital has faced challenges, and yes, we've made mistakes," he said. "But my commitment to better patient care remains unshaken. Those responsible for the breach will be held accountable." The janitor, watching the broadcast from a nearby break room, clenched his fists. He had overheard suspicious conversations in the staff lounge and knew where to start digging. Late that night, the janitor shared his findings with Mr. Lawson. "It's the same group that opposed you from the start," he said. "They're trying to undermine everything." Mr. Lawson nodded, a new resolve in his eyes. "Then we'll expose them for who they really are." The next morning, security footage revealed damning evidence against the rogue staff. Mr. Lawson acted swiftly, terminating their contracts and handing over the evidence to the authorities. The hospital began to transform in earnest. New training programs were introduced, staff morale improved, and patients noticed the difference. Weeks later, Emma was discharged. As she walked out of the hospital on crutches, she saw the changes firsthand. Nurses smiled warmly at patients, and doctors moved with purpose. "You did it, Dad," she said, tears in her eyes. "No," Mr. Lawson replied, wrapping an arm around her. "We did it. Together."